issue of what Goldman Sachs is alleged to have done, of fraud, of selling something when they knew somebody else was making a big bet that it was bad. Joining us, Sylvan Raines, expert in structured finance at R&R Consulting and co-author of the upcoming book, Elements of Structured Finance, due out this May. Jim Cramer and David Favor with us as well. David, let me go to you first because we all heard you asking quite a few of the questions there to Mr. Kuzami. What did you make of his responses, or in fact, to some of your questions, frankly, lack of response?
Yeah, you know, listen, I'm just trying to understand specifically where the SEC believes the fraud was, and I think you got at least some answer there. And just trying to understand how this transaction differed from other synthetic CDO transactions. You know, you've got to remember this market, and I've said this a number of times to you, Aaron, we've talked about it with Jim as well. It's a market that in many ways should never have existed, frankly. You had a $12 trillion physical mortgage market. Why did you need to create a synthetic market for mortgages? Nonetheless, it did exist, and there were a lot of questionable practices that went on in this market in the period of late 2006, early 2007, or all of 2006. We'll see what comes from here. Interesting that the SEC chose Goldman as what I believe will be the first of probably a number of cases. But again, let's wait and see ultimately what happens here. A lot of questions that I don't believe were answered, certainly by Mr. Kuzami in that brief conversation.
Right, and certainly a lot of reasons people could say as to why they would choose Goldman. Jim, let me follow up with you on a comment you made. I don't know if David had a chance to hear you earlier, but David, what Jim was saying was that he had found out that Goldman Sachs itself as a firm was an investor in the Abacus CDO, which is the subject of the fraud complaint today, and they were an investor betting it would go up. So, Jim, is that something that they were in every CDO that they did? Do you have any idea of the size of this investment? Obviously, both important questions to see whether this could help them in their defense.
I have no idea how they were positioned on any other piece of paper other than their Abacus, in which they had about a $90 million investment. Again, I have to ask you, why do they feel so confident? And not smug, but confident. I think they obviously have some facts on their side. If they did have a $90 million investment in Abacus, and I made it very clear that if their information was wrong, I'd just blow their cover immediately. I would have to believe that that's a pretty good piece of information. Let's also not forget that there is no requirement to disclose who is on the other side of the trade. I have often, when I was a hedge fund manager, bought pieces of paper that were clearly meant to be on the other side, a bet against me. And you know what? Such is life. I'm a big institution. Since when do these institutions have some sort of guarantee? These are not little guys who come into the equation blindsided. This is a caveat-emptor situation. The German bank, they had billions to be able to do research. What kind of research did they do? I'd like to know.
Sylvan, what do you make of that point? Which is one, you know, as David was making too. If you're coming in on one of these things on one side, you know that the bank setting it up knows there's another side, and in fact is setting it up.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. I'm pleased to be on this show since most of your previous guests were public relations officer for Goldman. Is it okay if I'm a little critical?
I don't like to hear that.
I think that people may take issue with
Goldman many
that.
times. I don't need to hear that nonsense.
Oh, Mr. Cramer, I would like to remind you that the word is abacus, not abacus. Now, I'd like to answer the question, Aaron. Is that okay?
Yes, but please don't make any personal allegations at anyone on the show. If you could please
that implies that
refrain
I take money from Goldman Sachs. I resent that.
Mr. Cramer, please let me answer. You had your chance.
Take back your charge that I took money, and I will.
Sylvan, go ahead and make your case. Jim will respond.
Okay. It's quite possible that Goldman had an equity position. They probably wrote it off on the closing date. So they stood to lose a few million and to make a few hundred millions. Now, basically, these deals were very complicated. I don't do politics, so I can't comment on the politics of this deal. Goldman Sachs was clearly in the know. They knew what they were doing. In fact, if they're defending themselves against a fraud charge, they would have to make a case that they didn't know, which I think too highly of Goldman Sachs to think that they didn't know what they were doing. Now, if that's the defense that they will, undertake, then so be it. These deals were made to be shorted. We don't have time to go into details. I want to remain shallow in deference to Mr. Cramer.
Hey. I ask you to please not say derogatory things about my colleagues. You can't do that on the show, Sylvan.
Don't give me a hound nonsense. I wasn't knocking you.
But graciously, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry that we can't go into details. These deals were extremely difficult to understand. It's clear that the bank that invested in them did not understand them. Mr. Cramer is correct on this. They should have done their own research. They should not have invested in them, but they did. So in some sense, they're also complicit in this entire scheme. It takes two to tango, and Goldman Sachs probably is just like everybody else trying to make an honest buck on Wall Street. So,
all right, we're going to take a brief break there. We'll be back in just a second. Sylvan will not be with us. Sylvan, you got to be more polite than that. We'll be back in a moment.